Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the No Dumb Questions webinar presented tonight by Dyslexia On Demand. We are so happy that everyone is here tonight. So whether you're a parent or you're an educator or just someone wanting to better understand dyslexia, this space is all
Do you want me to help you or no?
Yes.
It's all about learning and connecting and asking questions that you've always wondered, but maybe not felt comfortable enough to ask. So a couple housekeeping, it sounds like everybody is muted, but if we could just make sure and stay muted at this point, the only speakers are going to be our guests and our co-hosts tonight. If you do have a question, recognize you can add that to chat and we will see if we can add that throughout the night if we have time. So just a quick word about our sponsor at Dyslexia On Demand. We really do believe that every child deserves access to individualized, data-driven dyslexia therapy led by top-tier professionals. And that is never, there's never too much of a, I'm sorry, I lost my we are here to help kids thrive. So, we are joined tonight by three professionals that we're so excited to introduce. It's Jacob Santhouse, who is a licensed clinical professional counselor, Laurie Peterson, who is our educational diagnostician, and finally, Lorraine Hightower, who is a dyslexia advocate. And tonight we're really going to dive into the emotional, the educational, and the advocacy related questions that we all have. So just really quickly, I am Megan Pinchback. I am a certified academic language therapist and owner of Dyslexia On Demand. I will be one of your co-hosts, and I'm also excited to introduce Brandy Blaylock, who is our Director of Operations and Community Support here at Dyslexia On Demand. And between the two of us, we are going to be guiding you through this journey tonight.
Thank you so much for joining us. As Megan said, we have some top-notch dyslexia experts in all areas of the field tonight to really introduce to you and answer all of your questions. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists so you know who they are. They will be speaking throughout the night, and we will give you some information on how to connect with them at the end, and they can share more about other opportunities they have for you as well. Our first panelist tonight is going to be Laurie Peterson. She is the founder and director of Diagnostic Learning Services based in Texas, but she also does virtual testing as well. She's also a host of a very widely successful podcast titled Let's Talk Learning Disabilities. So you can go ahead and subscribe to that now and keep listening to her even tomorrow if you'd like. But through years of helping and testing students from elementary age to college age, Laurie has become extremely well respected and sought after as a voice for helping students and adults. Her peers praise her ability to always see the bigger picture when it comes to identifying, learning, and processing issues and ADHD. Laurie enjoys the opportunity to speak publicly as she is tonight, as well as to professional groups and public schools about how they can understand the needs of their students with learning disabilities, such as dyslexia and ADHD specifically. She serves on the executive board for the North Texas chapter of Children and Adults with ADHD. And Laurie's superpower herself is her diagnosed ADHD. That superpower is what fuels her love for helping others, which always includes being a devoted wife and mother. Additional loves are a beautiful day on the golf course. It's about to turn good weather in Texas for that, Laurie, and always planning her next travel destination getaway. Thank you for joining us tonight, Laurie.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be back.
Wonderful. Laurie joined us last year for this event, and you can certainly look at those questions. Many of those questions might be similar tonight. We will start with her questions first in a bit, but let me introduce our other two panelists. Our next panelist also joined us last year and is someone we work very closely with and love our professional relationship with her, and that is Lorraine Hightower. She is a certified dyslexia advocate and consultant, and she works with families to support children with dyslexia through the special education process. By working collaboratively with school districts, she's been able to help so many children acquire an appropriate educational plan that allows them to learn and thrive. Through her professional outreach, she continues to inform and influence local education leaders, legislatures, and community members on best practices for educating children with specific learning disabilities. In her role as a state leader with Decoding Dyslexia Virginia, she has been instrumental in affecting local policy and state legislation to improve the educational experience for special education students. Her advocacy practice is based in Lansdowne, Virginia. And I can tell you from personal experience, you will find no more professional advocate than Lorraine when it comes to representing the needs of a child. Lorraine, thank you for joining us this evening.
It's nice to be back. Thank you.
And joining us for the first time this year, we are very excited. And we were all fangirling a little bit at the beginning because Jacob Sandhouse is also a very well-known influencer in the dyslexia world, but that is because he is truly an expert. He is going to speak to us tonight on the emotional and social aspects of dyslexia and how to help your child or an adult with those kinds of challenges. But to introduce you about his professional credentials outside of being TikTok, he is a licensed clinical professional counselor who's very passionate as a neurodiversity advocate. He openly shares his journey as a dyslexic individual. So not only does he know this from his own knowledge in school, but his own knowledge in life. Through his speaking engagements and vibrant social media presence, Jacob offers honest, empowering insights about navigating the world with dyslexia, encouraging others to embrace their strengths and rewrite their own narratives. As a therapist, Jacob's counseling style is very relational and relaxed, grounded in narrative and person-centered theories. He creates safe, judgment-free spaces where individuals can be fully seen and supported, both through struggle and growth. His work centers on helping people build self-worth, navigate mental health challenges, and find confidence in who they are. In addition to his advocacy and clinical work, Jacob is deeply committed to educating communities about dyslexia and neurodiversity. His mission is to help others overcome barriers, amplify neurodiverse voices, and foster more inclusive spaces in schools, workplaces, and beyond. Jacob holds an educational doctorate in counselor education and supervision from Governor State University and a master's in mental health counseling from Moody Theological Seminary. He's licensed in multiple states, including Idaho, Illinois, Colorado, Florida, and Delaware, and has completed extensive training in neurodiversity, trauma, and supervision. Thank you so much for joining us this year, Jacob. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Wonderful. In addition to our panelists, there are some other very important guests that this webinar could not be possible without, and that is you. That is your questions. This is titled No Dumb Questions because when it comes to dyslexia, there are so many questions. None of them are dumb. And oftentimes it is so hard to find the right information. We wanted to provide an opportunity where you could submit your questions, not just Google questions, not just something from a handbook. What are the things you're experiencing, the things you have questions about related to dyslexia for yourself, for your child, for your school, for your workplace? So if you registered for this event prior to last Friday, you received an email where you could submit your personal questions about dyslexia. We went ahead and gave all of those questions to our panelists, and they selected the top 5 questions to answer. I wish we had time to answer every single question, but we don't. But however, many of these questions were asked multiple times and are very central to the themes of dyslexia. If you have specific questions that you still have during the meeting, during the webinar, please place them in the chat. We will have a little bit of time at the end where we can select a few of those questions to ask our panelists, as well as we will provide the information for how to connect with them in the future to where you can get your question answered. But without further ado, we are going to go ahead and start with some no dumb questions all about dyslexia testing and identification. So Laurie Peterson from Diagnostic Learning Services, these are your questions. I will go ahead and start with a very popular question that we get. Dyslexia is one name, but we know it takes many forms. So how, as a diagnostician, do you decipher between the severities of dyslexia, such as mild, moderate, or severe? And specifically, what is double deficit dyslexia?
So I'll be really honest with you. When we diagnose dyslexia, I kind of look at it like when you're pregnant. You either are or you aren't, right? You either have it or you don't. If I feel like someone has mild, moderate, or severe dyslexia, to me, that's based on what types of interventions they've already received that has impacted their evaluation results. So we may have a student that has already received some multisensory Orton Gillingham based tutoring from either a dyslexia therapist or through their school. So their phonological awareness may not be as impacted, or you may see some of that in the testing. They still have dyslexia. They're just not needing to start all the way back at the beginning. They've already got some of that foundation that's been provided by a therapist. So whereas somebody who would be more severe would be somebody who's maybe a little bit older, sometimes a later elementary, middle school student, high school, who hasn't ever had any interventions, and they've gone all this time without that support. And so there's just a little bit more catching up to do at that level. So I kind of I look at dyslexia as being dyslexia. How much intervention you've already received and how many of those skills have you already acquired through the appropriate channels sort of lays out then where it falls on the spectrum, if that makes sense. Double deficit dyslexia is really defined uh, by having difficulties in phonological awareness. So we always say that dyslexia is the inability to understand how letters and sounds come together to make words. It's the easiest definition I can give somebody about it. And so phonological awareness, or all of those skills that you really need in order to understand how letters and sounds come together to make words, that's the biggest piece of dyslexia. But we also look at what's called rapid naming, which is basically your ability to read fluently. And so, because when we're testing students or adults that potentially struggle with reading, it's very hard to test their ability to read fluently if the words are getting in the way. So, what we do is that our tests are designed in a way that they maybe read a page of letters or a page of numbers or colored squares, things I know that they know. My goal is to see how quickly can they move across the page. How quickly are all of those, what I like to call reflexes, working, that you look at it, you identify it, you say it, because it's a language-based disability, right? So that is the rapid naming part. So double deficit means you're struggling in both of those areas. We have a lot of people who are dyslexic who just struggle with phonological awareness. They can fly across the page and read a page of letters and numbers just fine. When it comes to reading fluently, when words are there, that's a whole nother story, because they don't always know what all the words are.
Excellent. And I love how you use that pregnancy analogy. You are or you aren't. It's not a little, not a lot. So great way of saying that. All right, moving on to the next question, just about testing dyslexia in general. There are so many tests out there, especially ones that pop up of quick screeners and things. But what are the best evaluations for dyslexia? And at what age should you evaluate?
So I'm a big fan of early intervention, and early identification is so important, because the earlier you intervene, my experience has been, is the less impact it has as an older student, adult, because you've gotten in and you've addressed the issues at an early age. You're learning to read just along with everybody else. You're just learning in a different way. And so by the time you get to that third grade, where now we're reading to learn, you've acquired all the same skills to read that everyone else in your class has. You've just learned them a different way, but your toolbox is still full of those tools. So to me, the earlier the better. Now, obviously, developmentally, we don't expect a 3-year-old to be reading, right? And so kids develop at different paces and different stages. My rule of thumb is I like to see a little bit of formal instruction in place. So I'm kind of like a 5, 6-year-old. I like the kindergartners. But if I have someone that has had formal pre-kindergarten and has had lots of exposure, and they're a little bit older for their grade,
I'm sorry, go in your room.
then
Listen to this.
I absolutely am totally fine in testing them, because I feel like we're going to be, again, you either have it or you don't, right?
Mhm.
The best evaluation to me is a thorough evaluation, because there are so many things that impact a student's ability to read. And so, yes, we're going to look at that phonological awareness. We're going to look to see, do they understand how the letters and sounds come together to make words? But I also need to make sure that they have good memory skills and they have adequate language skills. I like to look at everything because there are a lot of things that are going to cause somebody to struggle. And as you guys know, the last thing I want to do is recommend a dyslexia program for somebody who doesn't really have dyslexia, because that's
Mm.
not very fun.
Mhm.
I want to make sure it's an appropriate fit. So I definitely want to make sure we do a thorough evaluation, but I think it is absolutely important to look at phonological awareness, your basic reading skills, your letter ID, matching those letters and sounds, but also looking at some of the more fundamental processing skills, like your language skills and your memory skills, things like that, because it does require a lot of working memory um, to read and decode words.
Absolutely. And I'm going to just tack on to that question because what you just said, that's a pretty thorough process. So we're kind of talking about what the best evaluations are. Who are the best evaluators? Like who should really test for dyslexia? Because some people say you can just like take a quiz online or a teacher can do that, but it sounds like it's much more in depth. So who should these parents who are looking to get their child evaluated for dyslexia, what kind of professional name should they look for?
I think an educational psychologist. I've had people go to a neuropsychologist, and if you're going to go that route, make sure that they understand what dyslexia is and make sure that they're assessing phonological awareness and they're using something like the test of dyslexia, the comprehensive test of phonological processing. They're pulling the phonological awareness subtests out of the Woodcock Johnson or the Wyatt. We have so many standardized tests that we can use, but you want to make sure that the person you're going to understands dyslexia and can actually make the diagnosis. What I have a lot of parents say when they call is, well, the school said my child has signs of dyslexia, but they won't actually give them a diagnosis. So you want to make sure that whoever you're going to can actually give them a formal diagnosis, which is way more important when they get a little bit older and they're going to need that diagnosis in order to get accommodations on things like the SAT, ACT, college, MCAT, LSAT, you name it. Elementary school, not as important as long as they're getting the right interventions, but that diagnosis will become more important as they get older. So I'll be honest with you, there's a whole host of us that can do the testing. You want to vet the person that has the best understanding of what dyslexia is and how to identify it.
Absolutely. I love that you added in that part to make sure people truly do their research before even getting the test. Because it's a large amount of time and typically money and resources for a child to go undergo that testing. So making sure you have the right person, the right battery, great ideas. All right. Well, we talked about how phonological processing is related with dyslexia, very critical to it. But this question is kind of a myth buster here. So, if dyslexia primarily involves difficulties with phonological processing, why is it so commonly misunderstood as simply reversing letters? Those B's and D's we always hear about. And for individuals who continue to reverse letters beyond the typical developmental stage, what factors do contribute to that? How does it relate or not relate to dyslexia?
This is my favorite question. It's my favorite myth to bust, because I don't know who started it. I'll be honest with you. I don't know where this came from. And I mean, even in our office, I will say if I reverse numbers or reverse letters, like, oh, there's my dyslexia. Like we all do it, right? It has nothing to do with dyslexia. Dyslexia is a language-based learning disability. It's about understanding, again, how letters and sounds come together to make words. B and D, P and Q, 3 and 5, sevens, those reversals are so developmentally appropriate till about the end of second grade. Now, again, depending on your child's birthday and how old or young they are for their grade, my son is a May birthday. He is a college graduate, but he was reversing his B's and D's into third grade because he was that late spring, almost summer birthday. So, but by the end of the first semester of third grade, it was gone. You should definitely see it. If you're seeing it in those earlier, K1 and 2, you should see it less and less. By the
Mhm.
time they get to third, halfway through third, you should not be seeing it anymore. If you are, that's a whole nother issue, right? If they are spelling and they are decoding and they are reading fluently, then there may be something else going on with the way their eyes are seeing the letters. We call it a visual processing problem. It's definitely, if it's becoming something that's interfering with their spelling or their writing, it could be dysgraphia. So there are a lot of other factors that play into that. But it absolutely really doesn't go with dyslexia. I will have parents say my child is in kindergarten, they can write their name backwards. They can, because they're still their right left hemispheres are still developing, and that is okay. You should see it less and less as they mature and as they develop and as they sort of, third grade to me is kind of that benchmark year. So much happens in third grade, right? But that's the year that we usually see it really sort of start to fade, and you shouldn't see it anymore after that. So I hope that answers that question. But it's a huge myth, and I would love to find out where it started.
I think it's so hard too, because like you said, it is developmental. And we also want that early diagnosis and identification for dyslexia. So there are going to be some things that feel like they overlap because they're letters. So thank you for providing some clarity on that and admitting that even you say it at times because it is that popular. It comes up all the
Mhm.
time. All right, next question, Lori. Since if we get that early testing, how often do we need to update testing to ensure that we're having age appropriate insight, especially thinking about a little one in first or second grade versus like an 18-year-old about to go to college? How often do we need to test?
Making progress once they have that diagnosis, they're getting their interventions, they're making progress. You feel good about what you see. I don't see a need to reevaluate unless something new comes up, there's a new concern, or you're at one of those pinnacle places in your educational career that you just need to have current documentation of your learning disability, and that's SAT, ACTs, or AP exams when you're in high school. College disability support often requires, some do, some don't,
Mhm.
and beyond. So I tell parents, I don't need to see you again unless something changes or unless you get to a point where someone's going to require current documentation of your disability. SAT, ACT colleges, we have people call us all the time like, this is so silly. They're dyslexic. It doesn't go away. And you're right, it doesn't. But it looks really different in 10th grade than it did in first grade. And that's all they want to see is, how is it impacting you today versus how it impacted you in elementary school? Because chances are good you've had some interventions. You're probably able to read a lot better than you were. So where is it having its biggest impact now? That can then justify the need for any types of accommodations on those tests.
I think that's a great point because I think a lot of times we think about testing as in like tracking growth. But from the identification standpoint, once you've been identified, you've been identified. And if they're getting intervention, I know we're not talking about that as much tonight. Hopefully, they would be undergoing some thorough, very structured progress monitoring to really look to
Exactly.
make sure they are making the progress, which kind of falls under a different umbrella that we can talk about a little bit later. So I'm really glad that you think about that transfer into intervention for that. It's very key. All right, next question, Lori. We have an attendee who is wondering if there's any future or long-term benefit to obtaining an official dyslexia diagnosis for their daughter. And if so, what time frame would you suggest? So if you think that they're dyslexic, they're getting help and they're making improvement, do they still need that diagnosis? What would that mean in the long term?
We see this with a lot of homeschool kids who don't need that formal accommodation plan for school. And so it's like, well, why do I really need it? Well, in order to get, especially if you are providing any kinds of accommodations, like allowing them extra time to finish tests or reading tests to them, anything that they wouldn't get in a regular public or private school setting, that diagnosis actually opens a lot of doors for them, and that documentation actually provides them the ability then to receive those accommodations and that support. Again, SAT, ACT, AP exams, college disability services, or if they decide to transition to a public school in a homeschool student case, in order to get an official 504 plan or accommodation plan there. So there are actually really good. I tell parents, there's nothing negative about it. It doesn't hold them back to have that diagnosis. It only opens doors for them, and for them to, learn how to advocate for themselves and understand their strengths and weaknesses. I'm a huge, huge proponent of having those older kids, those high school kids, be a part of the review of the evaluation, because I want them to hear how smart they are and all the things they're really good at. And then why these accommodations are going to be so important to them and how they will benefit them, so that they will be more likely to stand up for that and say, hey, don't forget, I get to take my test over here and I get to have it read to me, or I get more time, because that only then just, encourages their success moving forward.
Absolutely. I always like to tell parents and students, having a dyslexia diagnosis is not having an excuse for not being able to do something. It's having a reason. And so once you have that reason, then you can have the solution to move forward. So I love that point that you brought up about different schooling situations. So critical for sure. Well, Lori, thank you so much for those questions. And we'll bring you back in for some of the live questions
Absolutely.
as well as any that were submitted. And if other panelists want to be able to tag on to questions, please do so. We are going to go ahead and move forward with Lorraine Hightower answering your no dumb questions about dyslexia advocacy and support. And our first question for you, Lorraine, is what advice do you give parents when they're meeting with an IEP team that is very defensive and non-cooperative? I'm sure you've never come across this in your practice whatsoever. So give
Well,
us your best tips for helping get your points across that IEP table with that team.
yes, I really appreciate this question because IEP meetings are emotionally charged for families and for parents. Obviously, you're talking about your child, and too often you're talking about what your child cannot do as opposed to what your child can do or their strengths. So I do appreciate that for parents, they're already going in, the meeting is a bit emotionally charged and could be difficult. And so if you have an IEP team that is very defensive or non-cooperative, I do want to say try not to take it personal, even though it may feel personal. I also encourage parents to, kind of model the professionalism that they expect in return. And the key recommendation is to make the conversation focused on data. So a lot of the times you will find in these defensive meetings, it's because people are giving their opinion or what they think the child can do or can't do or what they think might be better. And as long as the team is using all available data, which might be an evaluation, like Laurie's saying, it might be a skill assessment, a work sample, as long as they're trying to identify what are the needs of the child, academic needs, social emotional needs, functional needs, based on all available data to guide decision making, that can actually change things quite significantly because you're not talking about what people believe or just kind of brainstorming ideas. The other point that I want to make is parents, often don't know their rights when they go into these IEP meetings. And we talk a lot about this, Brandy, when we're collaborating with IEP teams. One tip that works really well with defensive or non-collaborative school teams is to audio record the conversation. So most states will allow parents to audio record the IEP meeting as long as you give, ample notice. And I find as an advocate, when the meeting is being audio recorded, people will choose words differently. They will say things differently. If you ask them to clarify, they will clarify what they said differently. They might walk it back a bit. So that can be a huge help to kind of leveling the playing field for parents. And, obviously parents have to maintain their professionalism when the meeting is being recorded as well. And I do think that bringing a qualified individual with you to an IEP meeting can be a huge help for parents, whether that is a, qualified advocate or a friend who's been through the process before. These IEP meetings can be filled with 5, 10, 15 school members. And so if it is a non-cooperative group, parents can often feel like they're under attack. So just having one or two, your spouse or a friend or an advocate or an attorney, that can definitely help, again, level that playing field. So you're appropriately represented on your side of the table if it feels that way. And then obviously parents, if they need to, can exercise their dispute resolution options if they've just had one meeting after the other and the conversation's not productive, the team's not focusing on data. Parents have rights, to request mediation, to file state complaints, to consider if they need to move in the area of due process, because they have a right to advocate for their child. IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, says that parents are required members of the team and that their input is a critical part of decision making. So the team has to consider that. They have to work with you. And if something is preventing that from happening, parents should know that they do have rights to insist that it be done differently.
That's an excellent point about leaning to the data, especially when talking about a child, keeping things quantitative
Yes.
where you can really have something measurable.
Yep.
And I appreciate those. And one thing that I will say from sitting in some meetings with Lorraine is always honoring the fact that schools are well-intentioned. And I think
Yes.
that is obviously something really helpful to do. So excellent tips, Lorraine. Let's keep on moving on. And we were talking about IEP teams, but let's talk about just the IEP. Can a child have a diagnosis of dyslexia and not need an IEP?
Yes, and again, I really appreciate this question because there's a lot of confusion around this. And as Laurie shared when she was talking about mild, moderate, or severe dyslexia, a lot of students who have mild dyslexia, they actually do not require an IEP. They can often perform above grade level expectations if they do have maybe a Section 504 plan so that they have equal access to the curriculum. They have important accommodations. They may need extra time. They may need audiobooks or read aloud or speech to text or text to speech, but they don't necessarily need an IEP with goals and specially designed instruction. So if they have that in place, they will often thrive, and that is an appropriate support because they are substantially restricted in the area of reading, but they can, given remediation or what they've had, or maybe they're older, they will do very well. Conversely, we have a lot of students that we work with, as you do, Brandy, you and Megan, that are moderate or severe, or they have double deficit dyslexia. And those students really do need an IEP because to identify all of their needs, to have targeted goals and effective, appropriate intervention with progress monitoring, that's really tough to do without an IEP. So I hope that whoever asked that question, I hope that is helpful.
Absolutely. I think that's a great question, because there's so many ways you can navigate dyslexia in an academic environment. So,
well, and Brandy, I just want to add that, when we think of dyslexia, school teams are really looking at the impact. I think Laurie said this well, that you can have dyslexia, you're either pregnant or not pregnant, or dyslexic or not dyslexic, but the impact is what schools really have to look at.
Absolutely. Excellent points. Next question. Speaking of schools, that's often, since this is related to academics, you're often working with the school. How do you get that school to properly identify your child as having dyslexia and not just a specific learning disability? I think this is the $1,000,000 question for a lot of people.
Yes.
Especially depending on what state you're in. And as Lorraine is in Virginia, she's the perfect person to ask. So,
well, no, I loved this question because, as you said, it is the $1,000,000 question. And there's, again, a lot of confusion for parents around what does it mean if they identify my child as having specific learning disability as opposed to having dyslexia. And I think for context, we have to keep in mind that schools do not diagnose disabilities, right? They're not qualified to diagnose. But they absolutely are obligated under IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, to identify educational needs and areas of deficit that are having an adverse impact on the student. And there are tests that school psychologists can give, school educational diagnosticians that are indicators of dyslexia. And these absolutely can be done. So this is why it's really important. From this question, I didn't know if this parent had a child who they know has dyslexia or they have a child who doesn't have dyslexia. So I kind of wanted to answer it in both ways. If you are a parent of a child that you suspect has dyslexia, but you don't know that, obviously you want to use the child find obligation under IDEA to say that you suspect your child has a learning disability, and therefore you are asking for a comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation. As part of that evaluation, like Laurie said, you really want to encourage the school district to look at all areas of processing, like phonological, orthographic, rapid naming, look at all the academic areas where there might be need, get a comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation. That's going to tell you, do they have a specific learning disability and do they qualify for an IEP? If parents disagree with that school evaluation, they also have the right to request what's called an IEE, an independent educational evaluation. And if that is granted to the parent, they can pick whatever qualified provider they want to work with. The district will fund that evaluation, and that often will lead to a diagnosis, or it will lead to confirmation that the child doesn't have dyslexia. So there are ways that parents can get school teams to identify indicators of dyslexia. But the question, I think, actually says, how do you get them to properly identify your child as having dyslexia? If you have a diagnosis, they absolutely should include that in the IEP or the Section 504. Nothing in the regulations prevents it. If you don't know that your child has dyslexia and they use some of these Peterson test indicators of dyslexia risk, and the child performs very poorly on that, and that happens on multiple assessments, school teams can say that there are multiple indicators of dyslexia. And I want to go a step further, Brandy, and say why this is really important. Because if they're writing an IEP for this child, when they're thinking about specially designed instruction, they do have to consider methodology. That's actually in the definition of specially designed instruction. So if you know a child has dyslexia, which is included in the definition of a specific learning disability, it's important for the school team to know that, because they can't select an evidence-based intervention that's not effective to meet the needs of a child who has dyslexia. So there's a lot I wanted to say about that. I don't know if you want to ask me to speak more on that, Brandy, but it is a twofold situation. But there's nothing that should prevent the school team from using the word dyslexia, from documenting in the IEP, and considering methodology when it comes to intervention.
And I think that that's a really good point about methodology, because typically once you name what it is, then you have to follow suit with the correct intervention. So from your experience, is that one reason schools may not want to dive down to dyslexia? What could be some of this, but based on all the observations you've had, what is it that's keeping them from doing that?
Yes, 100%. You're spot on, Brandy, because if they simply call it a specific learning disability, then there's a lot of evidence-based interventions that school teams have on their shelves that they can use that may give the appearance at first glance that they're going to help a struggling reader. But again, once we peel back all those layers, we get the evaluation, we look at the areas of need, we ask what makes this curriculum or program evidence-based for a child who has all the indicators of or has been diagnosed with dyslexia. And I always suggest to parents, have the school team list all the needs of your child that have been identified through the evaluation and the IEP process. Have them connect those needs exactly to that proposed intervention or curriculum. Unfortunately, we see all the time that school teams will identify, and they may even say dyslexia, that a student has a specific learning disability. And we write a beautiful IEP, and then we get to talking about what is going to be that specially designed instruction, and they will propose a program, which Read 180 is evidence-based to be effective. It's even accredited by IDA, International Dyslexia Association, but it is not for students who have phonemic awareness, decoding, and spelling needs. It's more, to help with comprehension, for example. So we will see school teams identify the child with a specific learning disability with dyslexia and propose Read 180 as their intervention. And uninformed parents, are just like, okay, I guess that's going to help. So it's nuanced, right? How we decide what type of intervention a child with dyslexia needs to make meaningful progress.
Absolutely. And I think that's that linear nature of testing, identification, school support. Where are we moving to? You always have to think, where are we moving to? Make sure that stop ahead is going to be thorough enough to get you to that point. So I'm very glad that you brought up the methodology aspect.
Yeah, but I do want to, before we leave that question, because I think it is an obligation of school teams. If they have a child in their classroom, and again, as I say often, Brandy, I do believe that teachers are very well intentioned. It's one of the toughest jobs. So I'm not saying this to put teachers in the hot seat, but under Child Find, there is an obligation to locate, identify, and evaluate students who are suspected of having a learning disability. So not just parents should be making these referrals for these evaluations and these deeper dives and to find out areas of need. Teachers who are seeing struggling readers, students who can't, if your district has literacy screeners and you're seeing that some of your students are in the red zone or high risk, they also need to be considering when is it appropriate to make a referral for a deeper dive into a comprehensive evaluation.
That's an excellent point. I know we have many teachers who are here tonight,
Yes.
and that is helpful information. As a former teacher myself, I know the struggle when you see a student struggling and you don't know what to do to help. The first is to seek help. And so having that is very important.
Yeah.
All right, next question. Still kind of myth busting a little. How do we help our school break the old thinking of let's just wait and see instead of pursuing that early identification so kids don't have to wait so long and get behind in school?
Yes. So I also loved this question because my advocacy team is comprised of parents, certified dyslexia advocates, and teachers. So I have some veteran teachers on my team, and they say, we always heard this, like you have to wait until 8 before you can actually be concerned about a student's reading. But, again, I think that Laurie said this too, early identification is really prevention at its best form, right? Even in Virginia, my home state here, we are seeing that based on legislation, they are actually changing the English language arts curriculums for elementary schools as a preventative measure to kind of address the needs of struggling readers and not have so many students referred through the special education process. And so to break this old thinking, I think that it's helpful for parents to, again, use data and use resources to kind of educate the school teams on what is possible. The National Reading Panel, which many may know about, did a great report in 2000 where they actually identified kindergartners with struggling readers, and they said, kindergarten is not too early to identify students who have phonemic awareness, decoding, encoding, challenges. So when I often will share that with school teams that the National Reading Panel started to talk about the needs of kindergartners, they find that surprising. And when we also use tools, like some school districts will have literacy screeners, they will use DIBELS, or they will use, in Virginia, we use what's called the VALS assessment, the Virginia Literacy Language and Literacy Screening Test. So there are different assessments. Some schools don't have these literacy assessments, but if you ask, do you have a reading specialist? Can we get a phonemic awareness screening test done, or a core phonics to check the student's decoding, or what do you use to measure fluency? You can sometimes get like a standalone skill assessment in each of these areas before the school team will agree to go to a formal evaluation. So there's a lot of ways that you can encourage the school team to kind of break this mindset of that we have to wait till they're in 3rd grade or we have to wait until they're 8. And the most important point that I love to share, and I'm not a psychologist, Laurie, is that these assessments are norm referenced and standardized by age, so that when a team is evaluating a child, if they're looking at basic phonemic awareness skills or decoding, this is not being done in a vacuum. They're being compared to their same age and grade level peers. So when they are borderline deficient, they are borderline deficient, which is indicating an area of need. And that is, obviously the data speaks for itself. When school teams see that, it's hard to refute that we should have waited, right, to test that child.
Absolutely. It's so hard because, as Laurie mentioned, so much of this is about developmental, especially like the handwriting component. So I think they're like, let's just see if it works out with that. But there are those early flags as early as kindergarten. And
Right.
it's nice to see so many states adopting that now. It's starting to finally take on. So knowing.
And even, oh, I'm sorry, Brittany, I just had a thought that popped in. I was going to say, even if your district doesn't have a literacy screener and you can't get them to agree to an which obviously should be documented in a prior written notice, to parents where they will audio record their child reading at home and they will share that with the school team, or they will pull out the thank you notes that their child wrote with the multiple misspelled words in the thank you note or the journal. Use whatever, it all comes back to data in my mind. Use the data you have to create the concern that this is a student who is suspected of having a learning disability, because then the child find obligation comes in. And now we need to figure out, does the child have a learning disability? So, too often parents will go and say, I think, and I believe, and will you test to find out? But as parents, you can come with your own data, anecdotal data, and say, I suspect my child has a learning disability, and encourage them not to wait, and cite the, National Reading Panel and other resources that say, it's not necessary to wait.
That's an excellent tip about creating your own data, especially at those early ages, because we always like to tell the parents we meet with that mother's intuition
Yes.
is sometimes a valid assessment, especially at those early ages. And so being able to collect that and show that it's not just feeling like you're just overburdening or such, but you have that information and you can see it with your eyes.
Right. Yeah.
All right, our next question is how can parents effectively advocate for appropriate, evidence-based reading interventions when a school insists on using a program that does not meet their child's needs?
Yes, and I don't want to sound like a broken record because I'm going to say some of the same things that I've said before, but I like this question because it's a common one. Parents are often asking me, how do we get the appropriate intervention for our child? But in that question is the answer, because it says when a school insists on using a program that does not meet their child's needs. So again, how do we get agreement on what the child needs? It all goes back to data. It can be formal data, it can be informal data. So if there was, if it's an IEP, and we're talking about specially designed instruction, there was an evaluation. There might be a private evaluation in addition to the school district evaluation. So we've got to agree on what the child's developmental, functional, and academic needs are. Then from there, we can ask the school team, with these needs, what are you proposing as the specially designed instruction? Once they propose that, you can ask them what makes that evidence-based, right? When something is evidence-based, it means it's scientifically valid. There's evidence to show that it was made a significant improvement for kids who had similar needs. So back to the example that I was sharing, it doesn't make sense for a school district to propose a reading comprehension program for a child who has phonemic awareness, decoding and spelling needs, because it might be evidence-based, but it doesn't align with this child's needs. And I'm always a fan of, encouraging parents to say the I in IEP is individualized, because many times they will go to an IEP meeting and the school district will say, well, this is how we address it here. We have a group, we have a program, we have, this is what we offer. We have one teacher who does this but IDEA requires that an IEP that meets all of the block, and the teacher have the needs of that group, or that group may be behind or ahead of that student. Um, for parents to do this sometimes, if you're telling you, ask somebody from the school, a private clinician, a friend, child needs. And this program evidence-based. I really want to read why it's effective, what are the skills that were improved. You'll be able to tell pretty clearly if it is a program that's going to meet all your child's needs. So I hope that's helpful, Brandy.
I love that point about the I is for individualized, because so often I think that schools do have their list of these are the programs we offer. And
Right.
it's like a menu at a restaurant of just select which one fits the schedule, which one works for the time that they need, instead of really what their needs are. So excellent question.
Yeah, and one other thing that I want to just suggest is that, parents are equal members of the IEP team. So they actually have to convince parents. In some states, like Virginia is a consent state. If they don't have the parents' consent for that intervention, they can't implement it. And there's a handful of consent states. But let's just say hypothetically, you're not in a consent state and the school team feels strongly that this intervention is going to work. Well, I would absolutely negotiate with that team. How long do you think it will take before we will see meaningful? Let's make sure we reconvene. And and the negotiation.
I'm hopeful everyone can still hear us. Can you still hear us okay? Okay, I think Lorraine may have led out just a little bit. Sorry, Lorraine, are you still there?
I am still here. I apologize. I'm not sure what happened,
Okay, that's
but
okay.
I
I wasn't sure if it was on my end or not, but
was just saying that.
lost Lorraine for a little bit. So we will definitely come back when her connection is better and we will make sure that she's able to finish that question out. But technology is just a beautiful thing, right? Sometimes it happens. So we will go ahead and move forward to our next panelist. Thank you so much, Lorraine, for all of your help on those excellent questions. Those were some very popular ones and lots of dense advice in there. So hope you all have time to digest it. Jacob, we are going to go ahead and move on to you. So we are going to talk about the no dumb questions that were submitted about social emotional support for dyslexia. We know this is so important for our kids. So we are looking forward to hearing your answers. Our first question is, how do I talk to my child about their dyslexia in a way that empowers her and doesn't deflate her confidence? Not feeling like something's wrong, but really does help.
I love this question. And part of what's really important about answering a question like this is that we have a very specific thing we usually think about when we think about confidence. Like you think about, are you good at this thing that we're talking about? Are you confident to do this thing? And that's not really what confidence is when we're talking about our understanding of self. Like confidence in ourselves is, can I sit and look at me in the mirror and be like, that's me. I see that person and I can hold them in high regard without judgment. And I think that's a really important thing to separate here, because when you think about something like dyslexia, so often, as has already been mentioned tonight, so often we're talking about what's wrong. We're talking about the deficits, we're talking about the struggles. And those don't have to be the defining part of who a person is. They can be part of it, like they can be part of how I make up my identity, but they're not the entirety. So I think what's really important is that as we're talking about dyslexia with our kids, we bring it up in a way that says, hey, this is a piece of who you are. This is just one piece. And I always like to start by asking kind of a reference point question of, what do you know about this? Because you as the parent will have an opportunity to kind of set the tone of what this conversation is like. You may not be the first person to bring it up to them. Like it could be a peer, it could be a teacher, it could be someone random. It's likely that there will always be people in their life who will contribute both positively and negatively. But the tone that you set in the house for how you talk about it will make a big difference. So if you talk about dyslexia in your house as like, oh no, there's this thing that's part of you, but like we don't really want to talk about it very much, or we don't want people to know about it, or it's this big secret, it's likely to produce shame. And that does actually harm confidence. Because the more shame I experience, the more I feel like I am broken. There's something wrong with me and I'm not enough. But if you can talk about it in a way that's like, this is very matter of fact, like this is the data, this is what this is how it impacts your brain. And then also have a lot of room in these conversations for asking, what is it like to be you? Tell me about your experience. And then also, because why not add one more thing? It's really, really valuable when you talk about it to also ask, like, what are the parts of you that you see as being like a real struggle? And what are the parts of you that you really like, the parts of you that you feel really good at these certain things? So I think it's really all about bringing in a conversation that's not biased towards it being really good or really bad. It's just kind of information, but that also separates you are a person and like this is just a piece of you, not the whole of you.
That's such a great point, Jacob, because I often hear it kind of swing the other way sometimes of, you're dyslexic. This is your superpower. Isn't this awesome? And so acknowledging it is a piece of you. How do you feel about this? Kind of keeping that open, acknowledging strengths, acknowledging what it is, but making sure that they have that. So that's great. All right, moving forward, let's talk about age with dyslexia. I think this is a really important one because we talked about early intervention. Some students aren't identified till later. they've already kind of gotten a little bit of that negative self-talk and that they still need the help. So this question is, what do you do to support older students that no longer want to get dyslexia services because they don't want to feel different, but they still need that intervention? How do we approach that conversation?
This, again, I love all these questions, so I won't say that before every single one. I think it's really, really important if you're asking yourself this question as a parent to check your own emotions. Like take a minute and sit down and see where your concern is coming from, because it's likely that it comes from probably a place of fear or a place of concern for your child and how they're going to do. And when you see them benefiting from something that they're suddenly like, I don't want to use this anymore, it's natural to want to step in and say, but no, you need this. You need this to be able to perform. And that's going back to the previous question, that's really bad for somebody's confidence to be like, hey, no, you can't function without this. And B, when you have a strong reaction like that, a lot of the time it's about you and not them. So I think it's really important to start by acknowledging, yeah, it feels really tough to be other than. Like to feel like your differences that your peers might not have are actually highlighted. And you have to rely on tools that they don't have to, and people see that. And actually make space to have a conversation with them and ask them, and probably this will not just be one conversation, but ask the ongoing, what is that like? What does it feel like to have to rely on these services that your peers don't have to? Like, tell me about those experiences. And then from there, I would move into like, what do you feel like you gain from these? Because odds are, if you validate the first part, like the concern about, well, I don't like using these because I don't like how it makes me feel or makes me look. If you validate that, there's usually space then to talk about, what do you actually gain from these? And then I am all about, the older someone gets, the more they do kind of get to make their own decisions, because you can't enforce them to use something that you won't always be around to enforce them to use. So then I think it becomes a conversation of, okay, so how do you benefit from these things? Like, what do you see the gain being? And if you don't want to use these in the way that you have been, what options do we have? Like, what can you think of for how you could accommodate the challenges that you experience in a way that actually would work for you? And so I would kind of place a lot of the ownership on them and say, hey, you are moving on into adulthood. You are going to be responsible for your functioning. What do you need that's going to make it work for you?
I think it's so critical, like what you talked about, embracing the child every step of the way, especially as older they get. That's going to be so critical in them embracing their needs and dictating what that is. So those are some great talking points for sure, especially saying what you gain from these, trying to frame it in that light. And I know that we get that quite a bit with the students. We see a lot of older students who at first might be a little bit more reluctant because maybe they've gone through lots of ladies who put flashcards in front of their face and they know it doesn't feel effective. And so how is this going to be any different? So allowing them the space to talk openly about that.
Yeah. And it's so important to remember. So often, like when I work with a lot of dyslexic individuals on the social emotional component, in a very common thread is, I feel other than, like I feel different than peers. And you have to remember that. And you have to remember that having to use services that your peers aren't using highlights that. It makes it worse. And that's hard. And nobody really wants that.
Especially at an age where you don't really want to stand out in that way. So excellent points. All right, this one's a little bit longer, but I really like this one. I think it's really helpful to both the student and the parent. So when we're thinking about dyslexia support here, so how can families best support a student that has co-occurring dyslexia, ADHD, and anxiety, especially when school avoidance and emotional distress are significant challenges? And then the part two of that question is, with limited financial resources and multiple support options such as therapy, coaching, and school-based services, where are we focusing our energy? Where should families prioritize to best support their child's social emotional well-being?
This is another great question. And I think a great place to start here is that when you're in this boat, like when you have a child who has all these things co-occurring together, they usually all kind of exacerbate each other.
Mm.
Like one in a lot of ways, when you're looking at your child, it's like you can't separate them all out. You just kind of see this person who has so much potential and so much energy and so much life and so much joy and so much struggle.
Mm.
And the impact that that can have on a family system, as in the impact it can have on the daily functioning of like there is order versus there's chaos, there's neatness versus nothing is ever in its place, can be really hard and destabilizing. And depending, particularly when you have ADHD in the mix, depending on the type of ADHD, like how hyperactive it is, that can also just be really disruptive. And so one of the things that I think is really important to start with is you're not alone. Like if you are a parent and you are seeing your child struggle so much and it's creating all of this emotional distress, not just for them, but for the family, and it disrupts so many of the things that you try and do, it's very easy to feel isolated in that because you look at other parents, you look at other kids, and you don't see the tantrums. You don't see all of the meltdowns. You just see them out in public functioning. And you feel alone in the fact that it's like, well, at our house, we have meltdowns constantly. And so remember that you're not alone. And I think within that same framework, it's really important as parents to get support. Like find other parents. If you're talking to another parent and they're like, oh yeah, my kid has ADHD, ask them what it's like. Or maybe share parts of your experience because odds are there will be similarities between your experience and theirs. And having a chance to share in that is really important because the way that you'll be able to support your kid best is if you are also reasonably healthy and not totally burned and suffering. So there's that. In terms of actually supporting the child, there's a few things that you really have to remember. One is that a lot of what they do that you look at and you're like, why are you trying to make all of our lives harder? That's not personal. It's them trying so hard to function and their brain is doing everything that it possibly can to get through the day. And that results in a lot of things that it's like, this doesn't work. This doesn't feel good. And you have to work really hard to constantly remind yourself this is not personal. They're trying, and it's my job as the adult, it's my job as the person whose prefrontal cortex is fully developed to be able to show up and regulate with them, like co-regulate with them, not get angry at them, not send them away every time they have a big emotion, but actually work to be present with them. And the more you practice doing that, like the better it is. Because at the end of the day, there are so many different support options that you have, whether that is family support, which not everybody has all of these. That is always worth mentioning, but there's family, there are friends, there's community, there's therapy, there's schools, like there are people around, and it is important to lean into that. But it's also really important to work hard to make the family, like the family environment that you're in, a space where they're accepted as they are, where they don't feel like they have to like try and hide the fact that they're struggling. And if you can do that, I think that gives you a great avenue to be able to kind of work with them to figure out what kind of support would you like? Like, do you want me to pursue therapy for you? Do you want me to pursue some specific intervention? Because at the end of the day, like what they'll actually need will depend very much on the student or the child.
Absolutely. And I think not just throwing everything at the kitchen sink and seeing what's going to work, really prioritizing that. You don't want to hit that overload button on a kid who's already feeling that overload. And I just wanted to highlight, we had a great comment in the chat from Becky, one of our attendees, that says, they're not giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time.
Yes.
And so really acknowledging that that's part of your child's profile and the things that you're helping them navigate through. And the fact that you really spoke about, you can't pour from an empty cup, making sure that the family is supported from the parent down and seeking that help and not being alone. And what are some options? You kind of mentioned like therapy, intervention. What would you recommend for someone who kind of has all of this was a starting point?
Ooh, great question. So many things. So yeah.
It could be different for every child too, but I just love to hear it.
I think first off, it's really important you remember if you have a child who is already getting any sort of intervention, they're already more likely to feel like the quote unquote problem child, which is not fun. And so it's important that you don't just immediately say, okay, so today you have dyslexia therapy, tomorrow you have mental health therapy, the next day you have like, you don't want to just dump them into a bunch of things, as you mentioned. I think it's really valuable to have them have an adult in their life that they can talk to. And that can be a therapist, that can be like a relative, aunt, uncle, like somebody older, that can be a family friend, somebody that they can go to and connect with. I think that's a really, really important thing, like especially for a kid who's struggling, especially if you can have an adult or a relative who has a similar life experience, that can be so incredibly validating and helpful. I think the like one of the things I often encounter with dyslexic, like when I'm working with dyslexic families, is there's this question of like, what's more important? Getting dyslexia tutoring to help with like the phonological struggles or like the language struggles, or mental health therapy. And I mean, the answer is that they're both important. But I think when we talk about trauma, like in the therapy world, when you talk about trauma, you always talk about how it's very hard to heal in the place where you're being hurt. And because of that, I think it's always really important that if you can, you try and address both. But if you can only pick one, it's really valuable, I think, to aim at the language first. Because when you can aim at that first, then you can work kind of to solve the root of like a lot of these experiences that you're having are connected to this. And we know that we know that with the right support, we can work on that. And as we work on that, then that becomes ideally less of a struggle, and we can move into how do we get you mental or emotional support. So yeah, does that answer the question better?
Absolutely. I think that's great advice, because I hear parents all the time that we meet with trying to figure out the chicken and egg scenario. Like, which one are we going to deal with here? And a lot of times, you have those behavioral complications because it's affecting the learning profile is affecting their behavior as well and how they're feeling. So thank you so much for highlighting some points there. Next question, Jacob, is what are some effective ways to help children rebuild confidence and self-esteem after negative or discouraging experiences with teachers, even related to the reading struggles? And this particular person said, even after changing schools and receiving more supportive instruction, how can families address that lasting emotional impact of those early experiences? So thinking about those battle scars, how do we come out of the trenches?
Yeah. You have to remember this idea that what nobody else picks up, kids will pick up. So if there is criticism thrown around, if there are a bunch of negative things that are thrown around in the family or directed towards them from people in or outside the family, and nobody ever talks about it and nobody acknowledges it, they will pick those things up and they will become a part of their identity. So one of the core principles, and you will like, this is something I probably have already said tonight and will say again, it's so important to actually be open to talking about the things. Like, I think a lot of the time people are unsure of like, well, how am I supposed to talk about something that's so hard? Like, isn't it better if we just kind of don't talk about it? Let's talk about something positive instead. And the answer is no. It's really, really important to talk about what hurts. It's really, really important when you know that they've had these experiences. You can't force a child to talk about something, but you can create a space where if they want to, they can. Like one of the things that we do, like in my family, that I do with my kids is when we're putting them to bed. Like I have two older kids that are 5 and 7. When we're putting them to bed, like we always spend some time with them in their room. And it's kind of their time where it's like they can talk about whatever they want to talk about. And I'm always so amazed at what comes up when I don't drive the conversation. When it's like, hey, let's just sit and be together. And I think that that's something that doesn't get practiced all that much, is that intentional, hey, I'm going to be with you. And I'm here, not on my phone. It's not visible. We're just being together in its space where you can bring up whatever you want. And sometimes it's funny and sometimes it's so, so sad. But I think giving your child space to be able to talk about these things and asking in a very non-pressuring way of like, hey, I heard about this thing that happened. I wondered if you wanted to talk about that. And if they say no, it's like, okay, no, that's fine. We don't have to, but you can always talk about it if you want to. And then I also think it's really important as you are as you're having these conversations, again, we're focusing, and so far everything I've said in answer to this question is about the struggles. It's really important to also make a lot of space to highlight what are the things that you're really good at. Like, make some time for those conversations and make some time in life and expend some resources. Like, when you see your kid being really good at something, make sure that gets to be a part of regular daily life. Because when we identify so deeply with a struggle, it can be really helpful to have like an inverse strength where we look at it and we're like, oh yeah, like this is really hard over here, but I know that I'm really good at this.
Great points. And I think sometimes as parents, it's hard to see our children hurt and we want
Hmm.
to jump in and fix it, but we have to hear it from them and help them
Hmm.
kind of fix it as well, help them get to that place and to
Yeah.
what they want. So I love that idea of letting them drive the conversation and having that space for them to talk.
Hmm. Oh yeah. It's so important, like you said, to not fix it for our kids.
Hmm.
Like, you will not be around, ideally, for your kid for the rest of their life. It's so valuable to let them develop those skills
Hmm.
and to let them lean into figuring out how to work through what's hard
I
and
think it's the
be there
hardest
for
thing
them
to
through it.
do. For
Yeah.
sure. Excellent points. And I can see that theme in all of your answers for sure. So it's a good
Mhm.
reminder for me as a parent too. So, what are your tips for balancing? We've talked a lot about conversations, but how do we balance the honest conversation about how hard dyslexia can be with helping kids also recognize the strengths and unique ways their brain works? Like, what are some
Mhm.
conversation stems for that, maybe? And we work hard to support our daughter's confidence, is what this person says, while also acknowledging her struggles. But it really does feel like a delicate balancing act. So, where do we find
Mhm.
balance?
This question touches on something that I think is a really big part of the bigger conversation about dyslexia. And actually, I try and post a video about this like once every 6 months because it's so important.
Mm.
It's really easy to err on one side or the other. Like, either dyslexia is a gift, it's my superpower, it's amazing, it's all of these strengths, and then there's that other reading stuff. Or the inverse of like, it's all awful, and people who call it a gift or say it has strengths, like they have no idea what they're talking about. That's like, those are the two camps that people often fall into. And it's so important to acknowledge both. So, again, going back to almost my answer to the first question, um, I love trying to always establish the kind of fundamental, what do you know about this already? So, talking to a kid, it's always kind of that check-in question. Hey, when I say dyslexia, what does that bring to mind? And allowing them to bring up what comes up. Because sometimes if you check in on it, it's going to be, well, today at school, this happened and I felt awful. And make space for that. Allow there to be conversation there, because usually what needs to be talked about is what will come up. But then also, it's really valuable to highlight, hey, this is just a piece of you. This isn't reading. Reading and language is not the entirety of life. That's
Mhm.
just a piece. And so spending time having these conversations where it's like, hey, I've noticed that you are really good at this, or you're really good at coming up with a lot of ways to solve problems, or like you're incredibly empathetic. In highlighting those things as part of this like ever ongoing conversation is really good. I think the place that we also kind of trip up sometimes is feeling like we always have to do both.
Mm.
And it's really important to think of a relationship with your child as this ongoing conversation. It's not just like every conversation has to have all the parts. This conversation, we talked about what was hard. The next conversation, we talked about what was good. The next conversation, we talked a little bit about both. And just always trying to like notice where we're at, what's presently going on, and what does it seem like we need in this moment.
I think that's a very valid point, and not thinking that it's always moving forward. Sometimes you might be bouncing back into
Hmm.
the struggle a little bit before you get to the hope aspects of it. So I think sometimes as a parent, that can be what's hard for balancing that. I feel like we were on the right and narrow and now we're right back to where we started, but you're still going forward.
Hmm. There's a concept that I wrote my dissertation on that I won't get fully into because we don't have enough time. But there's a concept within evaluating conversation that happens in family, that every conversation is recursive, meaning you go from A to B to A to C back to A to B to C to D maybe, like and it's always moving back and forth. And it's so valuable to actually allow it to do that without treating it as you said, as like, oh no, we've gone in reverse. It's like, no, it's all part of developing this greater understanding. And we move back and forth as a way of establishing reference points to understand what we're experiencing, to define ourselves and to move forward.
That's very helpful. We're happy to share your dissertation as well if you like to in our mail out tomorrow if anybody wants that. But I know that you are an expert on that for sure. So I appreciate you bringing that point up. At this point, Jacob, thank you for answering all those questions. Laurie and Lorraine have also answered all their questions. We have a few questions for the chat and a few things of just comments that I want to tag on. Someone made a comment about books, and I would just be curious, what are your favorite books to recommend to people who are navigating dyslexia, especially maybe within your professional realms of testing and advocacy and social emotional support, as we're seeking out different resources? What do you like to recommend?
I saw that comment and I saw they already read Overcoming Dyslexia, which is, I know Megan has talked about that book a ton. I know I have talked about it quite a bit. That is one of the golden standards for talking about dyslexia. One of the other books I tend to like is The Dyslexic Advantage, that comes at dyslexia from a very different angle, because it is much more focused on like the strength side. And then another one that Megan actually recommended to me that I also have connected with the person who wrote it, but I'm currently actually in Dyslexia Beyond the Diagnosis, or is it just Beyond the Diagnosis, by Casey Harrison. That one is also really good.
Excellent recommendations. Laurie, do you have any for our attendees?
For them, that was exactly what I was going to say, except for the last one I hadn't heard of. I'm going to look at that one.
Wonderful. What about you, Lorraine? Anything you want to recommend?
Well, I hope my Wi-Fi is stable. I'm so sorry. I've never had this happen, but I will say Sally Shaywitz's book is kind of a dyslexia Bible that is super helpful for parents, called Understanding Dyslexia. And it is a big read, but there's a helpful audiobook that you can get. And I do find that is super helpful.
I think Sally Shaywitz is always going to be in the top of the author section at Barnes & Noble for dyslexia. And just a shameless plug, we actually did a whole book club this summer over the parts of Overcoming Dyslexia, because it's a dense book. And the nice thing is it also has a lot of research in it. So that's definitely something that I would encourage you to read through the audio portion. And then we could also go through and if you want to just digest it via video with us, we can include that for you tomorrow. Someone asked about the author for Beyond a Diagnosis. That's Casey Harrison, Casey with the C. Another question we had was kind of about just testing profiles. So Laurie, this one might kind of go to you, and Lorraine, it might also kind of go to you as far as like with advocacy for it, but about working memory. You know, we talked about rapid automatized naming, and then we also talked about how working memory can be very much a part of the dyslexia profile. And someone even mentioned dyscalculia. How can we address that and help our students with maybe practical day-to-day tips, intervention? What do you think?
So one of the things I saw that comment, and one of the things I wanted to say too, is that we've run into several kids that have been tested through the school, and because of their weaker working memory, they were not allowed to go, or they weren't placed into any kind of dyslexia therapy because they felt like that would have been a hindrance, which kind of breaks my heart for those kids because they need the therapy, and that there should not be that kind of gatekeeping, I guess. Working memory is one of those things that I think just comes with practice. I'll be honest with you. I think it's, first of all, understanding exactly what it is and the ability to hold on to information and manipulate it in your short-term memory. So it's not regurgitating. That's your short-term memory. Working memory is being able to do something with it. So like one of our tests is when the kids we give them a series of numbers, they have to say the numbers backwards, right? That's working memory. They can't just regurgitate it. They have to hold on to it, resequence it, give it back. And if you think about blending sounds or sounding a word out, that requires some working memory. Reading and comprehending what you're reading while you're reading it requires some working memory. So I feel like, in my opinion, practicing those in baby steps, right? Don't have them read a whole paragraph and try to comprehend it. Reading, we're talking about sentence, even start at the word comprehension level, working into sentence level comprehension, and really just working on the skills that it takes to master that eventually will then start to improve your working memory. It starts to apply to other situations. following multi-step directions. I mean, there's so many places that we use our working memory, math. So I think it's a lot of practice, and I think it's just understanding what it is and understanding where you or your child fall on that spectrum of working memory, and then how do you adapt and how do you account for that?
Absolutely. And it's one of those things that just takes time to develop. And especially for students who do have deficiencies in that, I think that's really, really hard. And it often is a limitation in multiple things, even just following multi-step directions at home. Hey, it's time to go to school. And you need to say all the routines, having those visual routines, having them recall it,
Mhm.
having that sequence for sure. Lorraine, this is a great question about kind of accommodations and support. There's two questions that came, but I want to focus on this one. Is there a way to get funding for apps that could be helpful, like Speechify, Grammarly,
Mm.
Otter, when done in the school? Um,
Mhm.
and everybody knows there's a lot of utility in these, but as we know, app subscriptions are really expensive. Have you ever seen that as something to work with the school?
I have seen school teams partner with grant programs or special grants for apps and assistive technology. I don't see it very commonly, though. I will say it's kind of few and far between. In Virginia, we do have school districts that seem to be interested in partnering with different companies and get grants and funding. But I do think that parents can ask for reimbursement for some of these apps as well. If it's not offered through the school district and it's what the team determines that your child requires for equal access and these accommodations, then they can absolutely either they can fund it and request reimbursement, or the school district can figure out how they're going to put this in place for the child. So while I'm a huge fan of funding, it really shouldn't prevent a child who has these needs from getting access to those accommodations.
That's a really great point. And I think that it's so hard just to navigate. There's so many apps out there now of knowing
Mhm.
what's right. And you talked a lot about, evidence-based instruction,
Yes.
and navigating that. What are some tips for navigating, like trying to find the right names of programs to mention
Mm.
when you're
Yeah.
looking at methodologies?
Yes. So oftentimes parents will ask me which program, should I ask for? And it's not so much the program that we encourage parents to ask for. It is typically the methodology. So I think Laurie mentioned Orton Gillingham, which is a methodology or an approach, and many programs fall under the Orton Gillingham umbrella. So I think it's appropriate to ask the school district, what specially designed curriculums do you have? Are these Orton Gillingham based? Show me the research. I want to know exactly what makes it evidence based to be effective for students with dyslexia. But I do discourage parents from going in and saying, I need Spire, I need Wilson for my child, I need, I'm trying to think of some others that are common in our area, but really anything. It's just they can't make those claims because it does determine kind of limits the school district. If you say that to them and they just say no, you've kind of lost the intention of what you were really trying to accomplish, which is getting specially designed instruction in place that's going to be effective.
Absolutely. Jacob, I want to give one more question from the chat before we close out. There's so many great questions coming through. So if you don't get your questions answered, we'll definitely tell you how you can later on. But Jacob, this one's for you. It says, what do you recommend to help maintain kids' confidence when their younger sibling starts reading better
Mm.
than them? That
Ooh.
comparison effect coming in. And I have seen this even in my own household. So I would love to know your thoughts on that with the family dynamic. How do we approach that conversation? What do we do?
I love talking about it. Like that is both, I personally love to talk about this, but also that's it. Like you have to talk about it because so often those things get handled with secrecy. It's like, oh, we're gonna like let's pretend that's not happening, or like don't point it out. In it, that creates more problems because kids see everything.
Mhm.
Kids know. They know. They pick up on it. They're like, oh, this is different. This is different for you than me. And if it doesn't get talked about, if it doesn't get acknowledged, then they're left to understand what that means on their own. But if you talk about it, like if it starts happening more and more, and it's like, have you noticed this? What does that feel like? And if you can actually have those conversations and then talk about why it is that way, like dyslexia is the explanation. Your brain does this differently than their brain, and that's why their experience here is different than yours. That enables like a sense of understanding of why it is the way it is, which usually helps a whole lot. But then also that can open the door to other conversations where it's like, yeah, we see them as like doing this well versus you do that well. There's this, there's that. And you can kind of differentiate or tease out those other things if you need to. But often just being willing to actually call it out and have those conversations makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. Face it, not fear it, right? For sure.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, we really thank all of you for joining us tonight, both attendees and our expert panelists. I know I learned a lot. I always come out of this refreshed and rejuvenated, just all the information that's out there and just helping people navigate it. So we have this slide and we will include this tomorrow in the email that we send out along with the recording of how we can connect with everyone. Everyone's website and email is there, as well as any other ways they connect. But I want to give everyone just a little opportunity if there's other ways they can connect. Laurie, can you tell us how our attendees could connect with you?
I was muted. So email is the best way. Our podcast, Let's Talk Learning Disabilities. We have new episodes dropping every 2 weeks that we interview specialists in all areas of learning disabilities. And yeah, email is absolutely the very best way, or either one of our websites.
Absolutely. Lorraine, what about you?
Yes, you've got all of my contact information there, and advocate@lorrainehightower.com is my personal email. So if I didn't get to your question and you want to reach out, please do. We'd be happy to connect. And also, I'm on all the social media platforms as well.
Wonderful. And I did want to mention Lorraine has an opening for
Oh,
learning
sure.
more about advocacy as well. Would you like to tell us about that?
Thank you, Brandy. I would love to. So we're currently enrolling in a parent advocacy training program called the Dyslexia Advocacy Advantage Premier Circle. So any parents that are interested in that, it really is tactical and practical modules on how to use the data to lead your advocacy efforts for different outcomes and results. So you can check that out on our website. Thank you, Brandy.
That's very exciting. Jacob, how can people best connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on social media. So I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, all those things. And then probably the best way to get a hold of me if you really want me is through my email, which was on the slide. I have a counseling practice that I work with people that's limited in the US, that's limited by state because counseling is regulated by state. I also have a coaching practice where I work with dyslexic individuals and dyslexic families to kind of explore what dyslexia is. That's slightly different than counseling, but you can find that through my social media, or you can just email me through my counseling email. Yeah, does that answer that question? I think so.
Absolutely. We appreciate y'all being so connected with our registrants and our attendees tonight. And I know that we didn't talk about dyslexia intervention, and it's definitely not something we want to ignore. We just really wanted to highlight these aspects tonight because dyslexia intervention is a huge bite. So you will see Megan Pinchback's picture on this screen, and she's on here as well. And she can talk to you a little bit about ways you can connect with her specifically to talk about dyslexia intervention, because there's a lot out there that we've put out there for you already. And we want to talk about your child's needs. So Megan, go ahead and close us out and tell us how they can connect with you.
Well, and just really quickly, I want to give one more thank you guys to you guys. I hold all of you in the highest of regard. And, right when you think you know a lot of things, you learn more things. And even if it's just a new way of phrasing and thinking of something, so that I'm going to totally take and use in my daily conversations. But we do want to open this up to different questions you have related to dyslexia, specifically intervention. That's our area expertise. Know that you can always reach out to us directly over email, but additionally, we are on all the social media channels, especially in the TikTok, in the Insta, and the Facebook. We put out answers to a lot of these types of questions on a regular basis. So if you want to keep that learning going, please follow us on all those platforms. We also do, similar to Laurie, have a podcast I am a co-host of a podcast called Don't Call on Me, where we share stories of people's individual walks with dyslexia. Sometimes it's parents and children, etc. And it can be a great asset, I think, as you're continuing your learning journey. So just thank you to everyone tonight again for taking the time to deep dive into all of these questions. We do have more questions in the chat that weren't answered. We are going to do our best either to have the panelists answer them or for us to just share those answers with you, tomorrow. So make sure also, if you feel like you might have missed something, you want to listen to it again, we will be sharing that recording tomorrow. And we just thank you guys again.
Thank you everyone for coming. Have a great night.
Right at 8. Bye, guys.